like, and make sure to engage in comments and share this video to your friends and story lovers. And click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real horror stories like this. Have you ever felt that unease when you know something is just off? That sense of dread that gnaws at you, whispering that things aren't as they seem? That's exactly how I felt the first time I stepped into the apartment I was going to share with Tyler. On the surface, he seemed like your average college student. Messy hair, wrinkled hoodie, and that slightly spaced out look of someone running on caffeine and stress. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't one thing, but a collection of little things that added up to this growing discomfort I couldn't shake. I moved in on a Sunday, hauling boxes of books, clothes, and the essentials up 3 flights of stairs. The apartment wasn't anything special. 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with an old couch that looked like it had survived a frat house. Tyler's door was shut when I arrived, and it stayed that way the entire afternoon. I figured he was shy or maybe just busy, so I let it slide. But when night came, the first red flag appeared. I was in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A low, guttural grunt from the other side of the apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me pause. At first, I thought it might be the pipes, or maybe a weird sound from outside. But then came another noise. A heavy thud, like something had fallen. It wasn't just a one-time thing either. The grunts and thuds continued sporadically throughout the night, and they were always accompanied by this faint, almost rhythmic creaking sound. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was probably just Tyler moving furniture around, or something equally mundane. The next morning, I finally got to meet him properly. He emerged from his room looking disheveled, his hair sticking up in every direction. There was a faint, sour smell that followed him, and I couldn't help but notice his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He mumbled a quick, "Hey," before shuffling into the kitchen. I tried to strike up a conversation, asking about classes and how long he'd been at the apartment, but his answers were short and vague. He didn't seem interested in talking, so I backed off, figuring he just wasn't a morning person. But then there was the smell. It hit me the moment I walked into the hallway near his room, a thick, sour odor that made my stomach churn. It wasn't just your typical messy college guy smell of dirty laundry and unwashed dishes. This was something else entirely. It was sharp, almost chemical, with an underlying sweetness that made it even worse. I tried not to let it bother me, but every time I passed by his door, it felt like the smell was getting stronger. By the end of the first week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The grunts, the thuds, the creaking, none of it stopped. Every night, it was the same pattern, and it always seemed to start around 2 a.m. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he was just nocturnal, or maybe he had some kind of sleep disorder. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach every time I heard those noises. Then there was the night I accidentally saw inside his room. It wasn't intentional, I swear. I was heading to the kitchen for some water, and as I passed his door, I noticed it was open just a crack. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. What I saw made my skin crawl. The room was a mess, sure, but it was the kind of mess that felt deliberate. There were piles of clothes everywhere, some of them stained with dark, unidentifiable blotches. The walls had smudges, almost like handprints, and the floor was covered in what looked like shredded paper, food wrappers, and something wet that glistened under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed something even stranger, a small, rusted metal box sitting in the corner of the room. It looked out of place, almost like it didn't belong there. Before I could get a closer look, Tyler's voice snapped me out of my daze. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. I stumbled over my words, mumbling something about needing water, and quickly retreated to my room. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak, every grunt, every thud sent a jolt through my body. My mind kept replaying the glimpse I had of Tyler's room, the unsettling mess, and that rusted metal box. What was in it? Why did it look so out of place? And more importantly, why did he react so defensively? The more I thought about it, the more my gut told me that something was seriously wrong. The next morning, I decided to confront him. Well, maybe confront isn't the right word. I didn't have the nerve to flat out accuse him of being creepy, but I wanted answers. When I finally saw him in the kitchen, I asked as casually as I could, "Hey, what's up with the noises at night? Are you working on something late or?" Tyler's eyes flicked up from his bowl of cereal, his expression completely blank. "Noises?" he repeated, like he had no idea what I was talking about. I pressed on, describing the grunts and thuds and how they always started around the same time. He shrugged, shoving another spoonful of cereal into his mouth. "I don't know, man. I don't hear anything." His indifference was maddening. Either he was lying or he genuinely didn't care. I dropped the subject, but the unease in my chest only grew. That night, I decided to stay awake and record the noises. If Tyler wasn't going to admit to anything, I'd get proof. I set my phone up to record audio, tucked it under a pillow, and waited. At exactly 2:12 a.m., the noises started again. First, there was the creaking, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Then came the grunts, low and guttural, followed by the thuds. It was the same pattern as before, but this time, the sounds seemed closer, like they weren't just coming from behind his door, but from the walls themselves. The recording went on for over an hour, and when I finally stopped it, my hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my phone. I didn't dare listen to it until the next morning when Tyler was gone. With the sunlight streaming through my window, I felt a little braver, though my stomach was still in knots. The audio was worse than I expected. The grunts were louder, almost animalistic, and there was this strange, wet sound in the background that I hadn't noticed before. The thuds were so heavy that it sounded like something or someone was being dragged across the floor. But the most chilling part was at the very end. Just before the recording cut off, there was a whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Stop listening." I stared at my phone in disbelief. I rewound the audio, playing it again and again, each time hoping I'd misheard. But it was always the same. "Stop listening." My first instinct was to pack my things and leave, but I couldn't just walk away without knowing what was going on. I needed to see that room again. I waited until Tyler left for class later that afternoon. As soon as I heard the door close behind him, I made my move. His room was locked, of course, but I noticed a small gap in the doorframe where the latch didn't quite sit right. With a bit of wiggling, I managed to push the door open. The smell hit me like a wall. It was even worse than before, a sickening combination of rot and chemicals that made my eyes water. The room looked even more chaotic in the daylight. The piles of clothes seemed to have grown, and the stains on them were darker, more pronounced. I stepped carefully, avoiding the wet spots on the floor as I made my way to the corner where the rusted box sat. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I reached the box, I hesitated. Did I really want to know what was inside? Yes, I had to know. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I touched the lid. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so, like it had been sitting in a freezer. The lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing what was inside. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over one of the piles on the floor. Inside the box were Polaroid pictures, dozens of them. They were all of me. Some were taken while I was asleep in my bed. Others were from inside the bathroom while I was brushing my teeth. There was even one of me sitting at my desk, taken from an angle that could only mean one thing. Tyler had been inside my room. The realization sent a wave of nausea through me. My vision blurred as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I noticed something else in the box. Beneath the photos was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the scrawled handwriting. I know you've been listening. The second I read those words, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, like a presence was suddenly there with me. My pulse was racing, and my instincts screamed at me to get out of that room. But I couldn't move. It was like my legs were frozen in place, weighed down by fear. I know you've been listening. That single sentence felt like it was burning into my brain. My eyes darted to the open doorway, then to the corners of the room, half expecting Tyler to appear out of nowhere. But the room was silent, save for the faint creak of the floor beneath me. I forced myself to focus, to breathe, but the rising panic made it almost impossible. I snapped the box shut and stood up, backing away from it. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the thought that there was more to uncover. I glanced at Tyler's closet, its doors slightly ajar. Something dark was peeking out, a black shape half concealed by the shadows. It could have been a jacket or a bag, but something about it felt off. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. The stench intensified with every step, and my head began to spin. When I finally reached the closet, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. My reflection in the small mirror mounted on the door looked pale, almost unrecognizable. I swallowed hard and pulled the door open. Inside was chaos. Clothes were crammed onto hangers or piled on the floor, and there were strange objects scattered everywhere. An old pocket knife with dried brown stains, a crumpled paper with indecipherable scribbles, and a mason jar filled with what looked like hair. But none of that compared to what hung in the back of the closet. A black hoodie, torn and frayed, was smeared with streaks of what looked like blood. Beneath it, dangling from a hook, was a mask. It was made of some kind of worn leather, grotesquely shaped to resemble a human face. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting in revulsion. That's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound behind me. A creak. The kind a floorboard makes when someone's trying to move quietly. My body went rigid, and I turned slowly, dread pooling in my chest. Tyler was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent chills racing down my spine. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his voice low and eerily calm. My throat felt like it had closed up. I couldn't answer, couldn't even think. His gaze shifted to the box on the floor, and his smile widened. "Ah, so you've been curious about my little collection." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The sound echoed in my ears like a death knell. I backed up, my hands trembling. What is all this?" I managed to stammer, though my voice sounded distant, like it wasn't even mine. Tyler tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle. "It's personal," he said simply, "but since you're so interested, maybe I should show you the rest." Before I could react, he lunged. His hands gripped my arms with a strength I didn't think he was capable of, and he shoved me against the wall. My head smacked against the plaster, stars exploding in my vision. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," he hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath was hot and smelled like stale coffee and something metallic. I tried to push him off, but he was stronger than I'd expected. Panic surged through me as he reached into his pocket and pulled out something shiny. For a split second, I thought it was a knife, but it wasn't. It was a key. He held it up, his eyes gleaming with a twisted kind of satisfaction. "You've already seen this much," he said. "Might as well show you everything." With that, he dragged me toward his bed. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was relentless. He crouched down and used the key to unlock a latch I hadn't noticed before, hidden beneath the bed frame. A small trapdoor-like panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down to what looked like a basement. "No," I gasped, trying to pull away. But he shoved me forward, his grip like a vice. "You wanted to know what the noises were, didn't you?" he said, his tone mocking. "Well, here's your answer." The smell wafting up from the staircase was unbearable, a mix of decay and damp earth. I clawed at the walls, desperate to stop him from forcing me down, but it was no use. He was too strong. Step by step, he pushed me into the darkness, the faint light from the room above growing dimmer with each passing second. When we reached the bottom, he flipped a switch, and a single, flickering bulb illuminated the space. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding jars filled with things, body parts, fingers, eyes, even chunks of what looked like flesh, all floating in murky liquid. On the floor were more Polaroids, scattered like discarded confetti. And in the center of the room was a large metal table, its surface stained with dark, dried streaks. Tyler leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "This is where the magic happens," he whispered, his tone almost gleeful. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you're comfortable." I turned to look at him, my vision blurred by tears and terror. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, Barely visible in the dim light was another door. It was open just a crack, but I could hear something behind it, breathing, slow, heavy breathing. "Go ahead," Tyler said, shoving me toward the door. "Say hello." Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifacts for more real and true stories like this.